We've been learning about main idea and how main idea can also be called like the key point or the most important point of what you're reading. It's the most important piece of information that kind of tells the author's point of everything that he or she is writing. So when you were in elementary school, you may have had teachers tell you that you had to gist as you read. And all gisting is finding the main idea of each paragraph. So in 6th grade, what we're going to do is instead of writing the gist out to the sides of the paragraphs like you may have done in elementary school, we're going to find something in each paragraph that can help us determine that main idea, and we're going to highlight instead, and that's going to save us some time. Some of the things that we highlight are going to be the main idea. It's going to be directly stated right there in the paragraph where I can touch it with my finger and point to that main idea. Some of the things we highlight are not going to be the main idea. What they're going to be is a really important detail that helps us to figure out what that implied main idea is. And remember, an implied main idea is something that we have to piece together bits of information to figure out. The author's not going to come right out and tell us what that main idea is. We have to take the clues that the author leaves and piece them together with what we already know. So I'm just going to read through this passage, and each little chunk of information we're going to determine the main idea or something that's going to help us find the main idea, and we're going to highlight it. And you're responsible for following along and making your paper look like my paper. So the first thing that I'm going to do is kind of preview the way the text is laid out. And what I noticed right away in looking at it is that I have some big paragraphs and I have some smaller paragraphs. I don't want to have to read this entire thing and then think about the whole thing at one time. I like to chunk it up or divide it up into smaller groups. So that's the first thing that I'm going to do here. There's not really a right or wrong way to do this, but I'm going to kind of tell you how I think about it and how I do it on my own papers. And so what I do is I look for paragraphs that are 5 lines or longer, and those are usually big enough chunks of information that they can stay by themselves. So if you look at paragraph 1, you'll see that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines. So that paragraph could be a pretty good chunk of information all by itself. But then if you look at paragraph 2, it's only 1 line. And you can't really come up with the main idea of one sentence or 1 line. So what I'm going to do is chunk paragraph 1 and paragraph 2 together, which means that I'm going to read both of those paragraphs together before I stop and think about what I've read. Then if I keep looking, paragraph 3 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines, but paragraph 4 is only 2, and paragraph 5 is only 2. And if you look at 4 and 5, you'll notice that they have quotation marks in them, which shows us that we have characters who are talking. So they're probably talking to each other, which means they're talking about the same thing. So paragraph 4 and paragraph 5 probably need to be together because they're going to be about the same topic. And since they're both short, I'm going to chunk those with my bigger paragraph 3. So my second chunk of information is going to be paragraphs 3, 4, and 5. And we're just going to keep following that same process. 6 is pretty big. 6 is going to stay a chunk by itself. 7's only 4 lines long, so I'm going to chunk 7 and 8. 9's a pretty good size, so I'm going to leave 9 alone. 10's a pretty good size, but 11 is smaller, so I'm going to put 10 and 11 together. 12 looks good, 13 looks good, and 14 looks good. So those are all going to be chunks on their own. And so what I'm meaning when I'm saying chunk is I'm grouping them up or dividing them up into chunks of information. So when I get to the end of a chunk or a group of paragraphs, I'm going to stop and think about what I've read. And today what I'm going to do is find something that represents that main idea or that most important piece of information. So let's start. I'm going to go back to the beginning. This passage is called Back to First Grade. Crisscross applesauce. The teacher's voice bounced off the alphabet-lined walls of the first grade room. Immediately, the 6-year-olds knew to scramble to the reading rug and take their seats with their legs crossed. The room filled with their babble until Miss Sanchez called out, "Bubbles in your mouth, everyone!" All 21 students hushed as they sucked in air until they looked like blowfish. I looked at the students and gave them a thumbs up. That's the end of my chunk, so I'm going to stop and reflect on what I've read. And what I'm noticing, first of all, is that the story has not really started yet. I still don't really know what the story is going to be about. I just have some background information. So right now, the most important information that I can find is going to tell me about who this is about and where it's happening. So with my highlighter, I'm going to find something that's going to show me who and what this is about. And I can tell that this is about 6-year-olds in a classroom. So immediately the 6-year-olds knew to scramble to the reading rug and take their seats with their legs crossed. So that tells me this is taking place in a classroom, and it's 6-year-old kids, so probably a first grade classroom, which makes sense with my title, Back to First Grade. Next chunk. Just 6 weeks ago, I had been the envy of my middle school peers. For my mentoring project, I had been assigned to first grade, a desired position. Everyone figured that working with little kids would be less challenging than working with older elementary students. Story time, coloring, recess, and games would be so much fun compared with helping students with multiplication tables, science projects, and writing exercises. "You're so lucky, Chloe," my best friend Mania had told me. "I have to work with 4th graders. Ugh." "I know. It's going to be great. It'll be like having a couple of hours off from school each week," I gloated. So as I was reading that chunk, I noticed a lot of details. She's talking about all the fun things that they're going to do in her first grade classroom. So talking about story time and coloring and recess and games. She says she's the envy of her middle school peers. So peers are people who are on the same level as you. So our narrator must be a middle schooler. And she's doing a mentoring project where she's in a first grade classroom. So for one of her classes at her middle school, she goes to an elementary school class and she helps as like a teacher's assistant. So she's in a first grade classroom talking about how fun everything's going to be, and her friend who's in a 4th grade classroom is jealous of her. So what I need is a sentence that I can highlight that kind of sums all of that up, that tells us how fun she thinks this is going to be and that other people think she's going to have a great time. So if I look at all those sentences I just read, I like this second sentence, and you should be highlighting it as well. For my mentoring project, I'd been assigned to first grade, a desired position. And that's a good main idea because it tells me more about where she's at. She's in a first grade class. It tells me why she's there, because it's a mentoring project. And it tells me that it's a desired position, meaning it's something everybody wants to do, probably because they think it's going to be easy. And we're going to move on to paragraph 6. But I soon learned that helping teach first grade was no vacation at all. The first week was a nightmare. I was assigned a small group of students, Sarah, Allie, Cameron, and Fernando. Sarah cried every morning for any number of reasons. One time she cried because she didn't know how to use her scissors. I helped her, but then she started crying again because she realized she was the only one in the classroom who didn't know how to use scissors. There was no pleasing her. Allie had a bad cold and continually wiped her hands on the back of my shirt. Fernando refused to speak. Cameron didn't want to participate in anything. All right, so I'm seeing lots of details there about the really annoying things that all of those kids are doing. So Sarah is constantly crying. Allie's wiping her snotty hands on the back of our character's shirt. Fernando won't talk. Cameron won't participate. So all of these details are adding up to make one big point or to prove one main idea, which is basically that teaching first grade is no vacation at all. And what that means is, this is harder than I thought. Our character, Chloe, thought that first grade was going to be really easy, and she's figuring out that it is not easy. All right, our next chunk. I think first grade has changed a lot from when we were first graders, I told Mania. I don't remember learning about trapezoids and hexagons back then, do you? I'm trying my best to help teach this stuff, but the kids look at me like I've just arrived from another planet. Mania smiled at me, and secretly, I think she was thanking her lucky stars that she was working with fourth graders. Her students listened intently to tales about middle school, an exciting world they were looking forward to. They even completed their multiplication drills without complaining. It sounded like a great classroom to spend time in. All right, so I'm looking for something that's really important, and I don't feel like there's anything super duper hugely important here. She's talking about how her friend is grateful that she's in fourth grade, and she's still talking about how kind of miserable she is in first grade. So I'm just going to kind of go with this first sentence. First grade's changed a lot from when we were first graders, because I think that supports that main idea from the previous chunk about how first grade is not as easy as she thought it was going to be. Twice a week for 52 minutes and not a minute more, I worked with my group, creating patterns with geometric shapes, reading short stories, learning about neighborhoods, and much more. The days were also filled with glue sticking to things it shouldn't, and kids tattling about things they shouldn't. Most days I returned to my own campus exhausted, and I limped along through my afternoon classes. Once, after my classmates snickered at me, my teacher asked me why I was wearing a crown made of construction paper. I had completely forgotten that I'd been filling in for Cameron, who had decided he no longer wanted to be the king in the group's rehearsal of their skit, King for a Day. So we've got some details here about some of the difficult things that she's doing things with shapes, reading short stories, teaching about neighborhoods, and then she's talking about more annoying things like glue being stuck all over the place and kids tattling on each other. So it sounds like she's giving us details to kind of prove that this is an annoying experience or a tiring experience. So if I had to find one sentence that kind of showed me that main idea, I would choose this one. Most days I returned to my own campus exhausted, and I limped along through my afternoon classes. So all of those other things are the things that are making her exhausted. The glue sticking everywhere, that's tiring for her to deal with. Listening to kids tattle, that's making her exhausted. So our best main idea is this one right here. Then there were all of the first grade codes I had to learn. When Fernando held up 3 fingers and stuck them in my face, I told him to keep his hands to himself. A few minutes later, Fernando stuck 3 fingers in the air again, back and forth for the next 10 minutes. Those fingers went up, and I made him put them down. Finally, another student told Miss Sanchez in her outside voice so that everyone could hear, "Miss Chloe won't let Fernando go to the bathroom." How was I to know they had hand signals for everything? 2 fingers for a drink of water, 3 fingers for bathroom, 1 finger to ask a question, I grumbled to Mania. Again, I don't think there's anything new or super important here. It seems like she's still just giving us more examples of things that are making her life in first grade difficult. So I chose to highlight this, how was I to know they had hand signals for everything? Because that's kind of a way of telling us that part of her problem is not knowing the way first grade works. Paragraph 12. Mania comforted me as I told story after story about first grade. But as the weeks went on, I began to notice a change in our conversations. I wasn't the one who was complaining anymore. I had figured out how things worked in first grade, and Mania was the one who started to complain. Her experiences with fourth graders began to dull in comparison with my adventures with the 6-year-olds. Okay, so all of a sudden, we've got Mania complaining, and our narrator, Chloe's, having a pretty good time. This sentence right here, I think, is our main idea. I had figured out how things worked in first grade, and Mania was the one who started to complain. So we've had a switch around. And now the last day of the mentoring project had arrived, and overall, things had changed for the better. Sarah still cried, but less frequently now that she was deemed the student with the best handwriting in the class and was sought out by others for help. Allie had taken ownership of the skit the group had been assigned to write and produce, and she was able to get Fernando to speak. We soon realized that he was really funny and could write some really great lines. Cameron even relented and decided he would be king after all. So we've got a lot of details now of how great everything's going. Sarah's not crying as much. She's got great handwriting. Allie's helping other students. Fernando's talking. Cameron's participating. All of these things are really great things that are happening. And we've got all of those examples to prove the main idea that overall things had changed for the better. The students let go of the breath they were holding. The room was quiet now. My group returned my thumbs-up gesture as they sat patiently on the reading rug and waited for their turn to perform the King for a Day skit that they had practiced for weeks. After watching their terrific performance, I smiled widely, congratulated and hugged each student, shook hands with parents, and nibbled on tiny sandwiches. When I left that day, I knew I would miss those first graders, even Sarah and her endless tears. So if I had to pick the most important thing that happens there, I would choose that she realizes she's going to miss those first graders. All right, you need to hang on to this because we're going to be using it again in the next video, so don't turn this in yet. Keep it with your things. You're going to do this on your own with a different passage, and then the next day we're going to return to this same passage to do the next step.